supposed to do. Going to Facebook now. Okay. Well, welcome everybody. Thank you for joining us. My name is Matt. Thanks for being a follower of our social media page here at Midtown Reader. We really appreciate you. I'm really excited to be here today with Ben Montgomery, who was a former Enterprise reporter for the Tampa Bay Times, and who wrote a book called A Shot in the Moonlight. I'm trying to read it. That's how today's going to go. In 2010, Ben was a finalist for the Pulitzer Prize in Local Reporting and won the Dart Award and Casey Medal for a series called For Their Own Good, about abuse at Florida's oldest reform school. Ben lives in Tampa with his children and is the author of various other books. Really looking forward to hearing from him tonight. And with that, Ben, take it away.
Thanks so much, Matt, and thanks to Midtown Reader for letting me put my face on your computer. This is a strange time to launch a book, and it's a strange time to try to be selling books and to doing these events and all that stuff. So certainly appreciate those who are dedicated to buying books local and to supporting your local bookstore and your local authors as well. So I thought I'd open up by reading just a small passage that kicks off this book. January 21st, 1897. When the guns fell silent and the white men took cover, George Denning burst out the back of his little wooden house, wearing only his undergarments. He ran through the frigid January air, and when he reached the tall grass of a nearby field, he hurled himself down flat on his back, his lungs heaving, his breath visible and rising beneath a moon almost full and what seemed to be a million stars poking through a smoky blue-black midnight sky. He lay still and quiet and listened to the men's voices coming from the north beyond the house. They sounded at first as though they were in a state of consternation, but the voices grew distant as time slid by, suggesting retreat. When he could no longer hear the voices over the heartbeat in his own ears, he sat up, looked slowly around, then darted across the field toward his house. His wife met him at the door with his boots, his heavy coat, and his hat, and he dressed quickly without saying much, then turned away from the humble home he had built with his own hands, the only home his children had ever known, the home he had defended, and he disappeared into the darkness. That's the opening scene, chapter 1 of this book, which goes on to tell the story of a man named George Denning, who was born into slavery in 1855. Grew up in that system. Eventually, upon emancipation, this is all in Southwest Kentucky, by the way. Upon emancipation, he goes out on his own, begins to work to farm his own land. Eventually, strikes a deal with a neighbor, pays off a parcel of acreage, 114 acres or so, builds a home upon that acreage, and commences raising a family. And everything is fine with that until the night of January 21st, 1897, when 25 of his white neighbors ride on horseback up to his home around midnight and demand that he come outside. When he refused, whether on purpose or by accident, someone fired into his house, and he grabbed his own shotgun and ran upstairs. And there was a round of shots. One struck him in the arm as he ran upstairs, another as he threw open the shutters, the upstairs window, leaned out, squeezed off one round, and a bullet grazed his forehead. And his round struck and killed the 32-year-old scion of the wealthiest farm family in southwestern Kentucky. And this set in motion a pretty incredible series of events that was sensational at the time, but today has been all but forgotten.
And thank you for setting the scene. And ultimately, uh, you're a storyteller. This book tells George's story. And how did you come across the story in the first place? Like, where did you, uh, how did you find the story, and what made you decide to make this be your next book?
I was working at the Tampa Bay Times, and this was a short time after the shooting of Michael Brown in Ferguson, Missouri. And I had come across a paragraph in an Associated Press story that said something like, police data is not kept in any kind of systemic way in any nationwide scale. And it made me upset. And so I was ranting in a staff meeting when so much is available at our fingertips. We couldn't say how many times in the United States police shot civilians. And my boss, my editor at the time, said, "Well, do that story. Figure out how many times police shoot citizens in Florida." And so this launched what amounted to 3 years of work. We accounted for 6 years worth of police shootings in the state of Florida, and somewhere in the neighborhood of 138 times a year. But in the reporting of this, I wound up spending a lot of time with the mothers, with Black mothers who had lost husbands and children in police shootings, and I started longing subconsciously for a story that didn't that told about somebody longing, searching for justice, or maybe even searching for revenge or retribution, somebody who had been wronged uh, because of race, for whom the story hadn't ended in tragedy. And this was confirmed a short time later on a trip to what's uh, called the National Lynching Memorial in Montgomery, Alabama, which is a powerful memorial if you ever get the chance to swing by there. But it accounts for some 4,400 lynchings in the United States from 1850 to 1950. And witnessing this memorial, it occurred to me, by the way, every American county where a lynching occurred is accounted for with this large metal box that's about the size and shape of a coffin. And upon each of those boxes are inscribed the names of the victims of lynch mobs. And as I'm experiencing that, it made me wonder whose name wasn't on one of those boxes, and not that their story had been forgotten, or that their lynching had been overlooked, but that someone who had escaped or who had successfully defended him or herself. And so I was actively looking for a story that allowed me to explore those themes. And digging through newspaper archives, I came across the name George Denning and the associated headlines. And I soon learned that there was a lot of reporting on this sensational case, both the criminal trial and then the civil trial. And then, I had never heard of it. Some more searching suggested to me it had been all but forgotten, sort of lost to time. And so I thought, here's one to tell. I got very excited. And then I learned about Bennett Young and his participation in this and his backstory. And that was an incredible part of it as well, because we're still talking about this stuff today. We're talking about the myths that he helped create about the Confederacy. This guy who had defended George Denning, who had stood up for him in court pro bono, and had helped him, with his lawsuit against the lynch mob. This was the same man who had ridden with Morgan's men and fought, risked his life for the South, and then after the war promoted the myth of the lost cause for the rest of his life, maybe more than any other man.
Yeah, his story was, I think, particularly compelling to read because it's not tidy at all. Bennett Young's story. There's no clear like Bennett Young was a good man, or Bennett Young was Confederate soldier or a racist or a slave owner, or there's no, you can't fit him into a box. And me personally, that was uncomfortable. It was an uncomfortable experience. I can't imagine what that was like for you as you're trying to figure out how to frame this. And so as you're doing this research and you realize that this Bennett Young guy is not only a crucial player to George Denning's story, but to everything that has led to really the state of our current politics. Like, what was it like for you trying to figure out how to tell his story in a way that touched on both sides of Bennett Young?
Yeah, well, not to sound lame, but when I learned about Young's involvement in Denning's case, and by the way, if you're listening, I'm not giving anything away to say that Denning was convicted of manslaughter for defending himself, and then was pardoned by the governor, uh, and then eventually went on to sue his would-be lynch mob, those neighbors who showed up that night in 1897. He sued them in federal court for damages because they eventually had come back and set fire to his home, and they drove his wife and children away. So Young did this pro bono. He wrote letters while Denning was incarcerated. He wrote at least one telegram on Denning's behalf, demanding that the governor pardon him, saying this was a miscarriage of justice. But Young was an entrepreneur, but he was also an historian. He was an investor. He was a lawyer, a man about town. He ran the expo for Louisville, the World Expo in 1898. But he was also a friend to African American leaders in Louisville, which was not that uncommon in 1897 in a city that was fairly progressive and still had some sort of French culture. And so it wasn't all that unusual, but it was, it was courageous. Harm could still befall you if you took the wrong step racially, especially in the rural areas. Not many of these lynchings occurred within city limits of cities of any size. They were typically in the countryside or in small towns. So anyhow, when Young's involvement became clear to me, I thought, well, this is sort of like a buddy film, like the circumstances are more scary perhaps, but this is two guys kind of going on a quest together, going on a bit of a journey together. And so I thought it was also an opportunity to profile Bennett Young and to solidify his place in American history, because there's been very little written. There was a lot written by him. He did 6 or 7 books, but very little written about him since his death in 1919. But he was the guy. He was the president of the Confederate Veterans, which is a huge association, responsible for the burial and memorialization and medical care of veterans. He ran this. He was a fundraiser. He raised the money to build the Jefferson Davis Memorial, which is the tallest, phallic monument outside of the Washington Monument in Western Kentucky. All of that on one hand, but then on the other hand, he is going out of his way to help men and women of color have access to federal courts. In the case of George Denning and several other times, he founded an orphanage for Black children and served as its president for quite some time. So it's hard to strike a balance between those things. And a guy who dedicated himself who grew up with slaves. His father was a wealthy landowner, and he dedicated himself to the cause of the South, and then had some kind of change of heart, evidently along the way, that might not have been like a road to Damascus type moment, but it might have been slower, more gradual, but decided after the war, like, we were wrong. Slavery was wrong as an institution. And, there's evidence that he tried to sort of rectify his role in that.
So as you were as you were like chasing down these newspaper headlines and deciding that this was where you wanted to focus your energies in, what was that research project like, trying to, put all these pieces together? I mean, again, it's hard to spoil a book where you know how it ends, right? But through the book, there are some of your own photos from your own visits to George Denning's grave, to things like that. What was that experience like for you?
Yeah. Well, I love the reporting. That's my that's what makes me tick. I love research. I love talking to people. I love collecting information. I love going into parts of the world I've never visited and looking for graves on private property. Like that's fun for me. So hanging out in special collections and old libraries is what really makes me happy. What I don't like is the writing. I find that it gets harder. The more I do it, the harder it gets. The higher the bar is. This is my fourth book, um, and the hardest. Each one is harder than the last. So I try to put the writing off until the end, and spend most of the time just doing the research, which is what keeps me going. Um, Doing this research in particular because it's an era that I had never studied before, had never really thought about. Uh, I wanted to go to take the plunge wide-eyed to go live in Kentucky for a little while, which I was able to do. Stay, anyways, not necessarily live. Um, to meet and get super familiar with and build trust with the family of George Denning, the descendants, who I was fortunate enough to track down, um, and remain friendly with. That part was phenomenal. I checked into oh goodness, the name of the hotel on Fourth Street, famous hotel on Fourth Street in Louisville. It's escaping me right now. I'm thinking of Portland for some reason. Um, Anyhow, it'll come to me. But it's this place where Thomas Wolfe used to hang out when he was a young man. He would get drunk and he got inspired to not Tom Wolfe. I'm just completely blanking. Gatsby was written by uh,
Fitzgerald.
yeah, Fitzgerald. F. Scott Fitzgerald used to hang out in this hotel in Louisville and get drunk and get thrown out. So I thought, oh, let me go try to visit with the ghost of Fitzgerald and get some inspiration. Uh, Anyways, it was an immersive experience. It was me like jumping into not only this story but also Kentucky culture and trying to learn as much as I possibly could. And what a journey. Fortunately, the small town where part of this occurred, they've done a phenomenal job. This is in Simpson County, Kentucky. The Simpson County Historical Society has done a great job of preserving records for the town. The African American Historical Society in the same place in Franklin, Kentucky, has done a wonderful job of preserving some old records. Um, what got me confident, when you're doing a nonfiction book, you start off by doing a book proposal, and then you sell the proposal to a publisher, and then you go do the hard work of putting the book together. But you have to know enough about the material to write a proposal that's going to sell. So what turned that corner for me was I hired a friend of mine who lived in Kentucky to go to the state archives and see if there was anything about this case in the papers of the governor at the time, Bill O'Bradley. And so she agreed to do this, a couple of $100. She goes up to Frankfurt. Uh, that evening or the next morning, I woke up and looked at my Gmail, and she had sent me a folder with 513 Gmail images in it. Turns out the governor's papers contained the entire criminal trial transcript, which was invaluable. It let us hear from all these people who were involved, including the accused lynch mob, including the Denning family. And what an amazing piece of history to have made it this long. So that part of it was a blast. It was, super interesting. And I thought I might get some pushback from descendants here and there who, like, sometimes the people get their cackles up if you go sticking your nose into the business of a small town. I've learned this as a newspaper reporter working in Jackson County, west of you guys there just a little bit. But the there was no, I didn't run into any resistance along the way. In fact, I've heard from descendants of a couple of the guys who were in the accused lynch party. They've been glad to learn this about their ancestors. And they've sent, follow-up questions wanting to know more. So it's been a cool experience, the whole thing.
it the timing of this book, especially knowing that you started the legwork for it almost 7 years ago, um, the timing has to feel just incredibly almost cosmic, or fate, or whatever you want to ascribe it to. Knowing what I know about how the book publishing process works, you were probably submitting a draft right around the time that Breonna Taylor was killed in Louisville. And seeing, I think that the way that you wrote the preface, which again, I would really encourage anyone who's got this, come pick up the book from Midtown Reader. If you don't feel like you're going to read a whole book, read the preface. I feel like Ben's take on why this kind of story is relevant is so important, and it'll hook you, and you'll read the rest of the book. But you said, it was a quote from the UN report from 2015. Impunity for state violence must be addressed as a matter of urgency. And so, looking back at George Denning, who after being pardoned by a governor was then assaulted in Louisville, and then 125 years later, you're writing a book about him, and we've got this whole story about race and justice in Louisville again. Like, what's that feel like for you?
Yeah, I mean, and it was real. We were on 4th Street in downtown Louisville when I can't remember now. I think it was a march. It was after the death of George Floyd. Is this right?
George Floyd was June last year. Breonna Taylor was March last year.
This would have been before that. Anyhow, do not fact check me on this, but I saw a young black man, holding a flaming Confederate flag over a trash can, over a trash fire, and I thought, boy, this is still with us. These are the images that are still with us. This is very much present. This is what we're dealing with. I did not time this to anything. It is just who we are right now. Because of where we are, this violence goes noticed now. It gets attention. It makes waves sometimes across the U.S. There are a lot of times it doesn't get the attention it deserves. But the timing of this book it would have been just as important, I think, in 2015. There's a window here where we started paying very close attention. We started talking about the future of these monuments to Confederate soldiers that occupy all of our town squares, that were sometimes put on public property using public funds. We talk about the names of elementary schools that are meant to honor Confederate soldiers. And we talk about how they should be remembered. I mean, we're doing this now, even for leaders like Thomas Jefferson and George Washington. Finally, their legacies are being questioned, and we're thinking about how they should be represented to the future generations. So it was predicted, and I think I mentioned this in the preface as well. In 1864, the Civil War is raging. The New York Times wrote an editorial that was just one of many editorials for that day. I just happened to notice it, but it said, there will come a day when we look back 100 years from now, and we look back on this time and regard the institution of slavery for what it is, barbarism, the same way that we in 1864 regard gladiatorial Rome. When that day comes in the future and they think about who we are all going to be judged on one issue. And it's, the great moral issue of 1864 and a decade before and after, maybe still now, how you come down on the issue of slavery. They called it, and this is where we are in our history. How are these things to be remembered? I grew up in Oklahoma, and in the fifth or sixth grade, fourth or fifth grade, maybe, they celebrated the centennial of the land run. And we all went, we dressed up in our pioneer clothing, and the teachers took us across the football field, and they said, go. And we ran across the football field and staked out our own property. A bunch of little white kids staked out our own property on the football field and ate our picnic lunch there. And this is how the land run was taught. And it wasn't until I was an adult that I realized that that land had been gifted to Native American tribes who had been driven at gunpoint, had been captured in the southeastern U.S. and had been driven along the Trail of Tears to Oklahoma, this barren, godforsaken place. And then their land was, gifted to settlers. I say finally, like we have arrived, and until we start to bring truth to how these things are regarded or whether they're regarded, we're all going to be challenged. It's what makes this debate about critical race theory so interesting right now. I mean, that it's a debate is silly to me, but but that it's become the political red meat that it is just makes me roll my eyes. It's the same group, it's just stirring the pot on so many issues, little issues that don't even deserve our attention necessarily.
Yeah. You mentioned the stories that we're hearing now. These stories are not going unheard anymore. We remember names like Breonna Taylor and Ahmaud Arbery and George Floyd, and names from Florida like Trayvon Martin. We hear these stories, and one of the things that struck me the most reading your book, and you would not know it from reading the cover or any of the promo materials, is that you go out of your way just in telling the details of what's going on during this trial, to talk about lynchings that happened, on that day, in or around those places. I think there's a whole chapter on an attempted and successful lynching in Georgia. So as you're approaching these stories, just tell me a little bit about that. I don't know that I have a clear question for you there, but it just struck me, and I'd love to hear more about that decision.
Yeah. Well, I wanted to, first of all, when you read about a lynching or the issue of lynchings in, your American history book, I think those things seem distant, and they seem long ago, and they seem far away, and in some cases impossible to understand. And I think the reason is because they lack detail, and rarely, I mean, lynching as a thing, an institution that is responsible for the death of 4,400 people who never had a trial, or who were just killed vigilante style. To think of it in that number, that huge number, 4,400 people, it's not impacting in the way it is to hear in detail how these things played out. And so I wanted to introduce the notion to the reader, the fear to the reader that the thing could, for George Denning, his chronology could end at any moment. He could be abducted from the jail because it happened all the time. It was happening as he was there in towns around the South. He could be abducted from the jail, and not just murdered, but carved up. Like the level of sadism and barbarism, when you read about these, when you read witness accounts that ran in the newspapers about these lynchings, shocks the senses, and in a way that hopefully, in my mind, for the reader, makes that danger present and clear for George Denning, because it could have happened. And he was very lucky in many cases that it didn't. And also, he was lucky that he had a trustworthy system of white people around him who were also interested in justice, or at least the idea of fairness. And then, so show that danger, but then also to remind people or introduce them to the granular hideousness of what people did to one another in 1897, 120 years ago, not all that long ago. And so when I don't turn the camera away, when I go into like uh, you know, into that minutia, into that great detail or deep as detail as I could get, it's because I want you to focus that, and I want your mind's eye to bear witness to these events because they're so important, and they, played out over 40 or 50 years, and maybe they bring people to the point of understanding or empathy how that sort of trauma doesn't just disappear. It's not something that can be gone in a generation or two.
Yeah, and you mentioned finding George's surviving relatives, and I know that I have a tendency when we're talking about things that happened, Civil War, Reconstruction, turn of that century, to put like this like antebellum sepia filter
Right.
over my thoughts. But like I knew my great grandparents, I met them, I knew who they were, and so like within that kind of that level of generation, like it just stunning to me that this story was lost for so long. You were able to find it, you were able to find living relatives. I mean, just absolutely fantastic work on the reporting.
Thank you. And living relatives who knew the story. uh, it's often the case that it gets lost even in the family, but they had done their own records work, and wanted to remember those things, wanted to certainly memorialize their ancestors in death, um, which is pretty cool. That's a recent development, by the way. There's a person now trying to erect an historical marker at Eastern Cemetery in Jeffersonville, Indiana, to acknowledge George Denning's contribution to race relations in the 1890s, which I think is pretty cool. You can do a book and get a historical marker. That's makes me feel good.
Yeah, well, and you have, I don't want to go too far into, past work. We're here to talk about this, but is that something you're starting to get used to? You were a Pulitzer finalist for your work exposing the reform school culture, the murders, all the stuff that eventually became a Pulitzer Prize winning novel.
Yeah, right.
Like what's that has to just be a combination of the coolest feeling on the planet and just heartbreaking, these stories that have just gone so long untold.
Yeah. I have a great story about the Nickel Boys, Colson Whitehead's Pulitzer winner. I was hiking. I had the good fortune of hiking some in Europe with a friend of mine who's a lawyer here in Pinellas County. Um, and we had a big layover in England, in London, on our way back, like 8 hours. And so my friend Bjorn had a friend there, and she met us. We had some lunch, and then as we were talking, she was like, "Oh, so you're a writer? What do you write?" And I told her about some of my books, and she said, "Well, would they be here in the bookstore?" And I said, "I have no idea, but we could go see." And so I'm, trying to like impress this new friend, and I know they're not going to have my books in the bookstore, but maybe there's a chance. Grandma Gatewood's Walk has sold, 250,000 copies. It's like successful. So maybe there's a chance they have it in the Waterstones in the UK. We're on our way in this 6-story bookstore in downtown London. And there in the front window is a massive display of the Nickel Boys. And I hadn't mentioned anything about the Nickel Boys being based upon my newspaper work, but I did know that Colson Whitehead, in like the first paragraph in his acknowledgement, says, and thanks to Ben Montgomery. That was the first I heard about this. Anyhow, we're walking in, and there's a big poster-sized copy of I think the Piccadilly Review or something like that. And we all paused for a moment. I was like, hang on one second. And I start to read this, and I'll be danged if the second paragraph wasn't like, "And none of this would have come to light were it not for the courageous reporting of Ben Montgomery and the Tampa Bay Times." And I was like, in London in the front window. It's not my book, but it's my name. And I pointed this out to my new friend, and it was the coolest moment, maybe in outside of my kids being born in my life. So that's awesome, man. Colson is a great guy. He brought a lot of attention to the true story of the school. Um, and that thing has been a source for not just his book, but 5 or 6 books, both fiction and non, maybe even more than that. Um, I'm happy it's closed down. I certainly don't deserve any credit for doing that. I'm a reporter. I was getting paid for it, and I like the panhandle. So um, anyhow, it's pretty cool. And now I feel like this with the 4th book being out, uh, I'm writing a newsletter for Axios right now, which is a great thing to do. A lot of people around here really like it, but I'm going to pitch another book next year, and I feel like this is the way I'm a big boy writer now, and I'll like selling these things is a blast. Writing them, working on them, bringing the story to life is so rewarding for me. I would probably do it if only my parents bought copies.
We've got about 10 more minutes, so we've got time for just a little bit more discussion, and then we do have one question in the Q&A we'll toss to after that.
Cool.
And would you like to give a hint about this next book proposal, or is it totally embargoed?
I haven't decided what it's going to be yet. So if you have a story idea and you're hearing this, look me up online, and I'm all ears. No, I have some sort of general themes that I'd like to explore, and also some eras that I'd like to explore. My first book was 1955, and that was a fascinating decade in American history. And then the second one was about, it's set during World War II, and my grandfather flew in the Pacific during World War II, and so that was interesting to learn about. And then the third was the Great Depression, and so I covered that 10-year stretch, and that was fascinating. And then the 1890s became my most recent period of study, and so I want the next one to be something completely unfamiliar. I don't know where I'll have to go to find that, but I've got some parameters set up, and I'm shopping for story ideas right now.
Awesome. Well, so I've got 2 more things just to kind of lob your way. We talked a little bit about how this book and this story, is really relevant to our time and our culture today. For people who have lived in, Florida for the last decade, it's even more relevant. You have an entire chapter of wealthy white business owners and tradesmen and people from all stripes saying that George Jennings should be pardoned because of the Castle Doctrine, which is the predecessor to the Stand Your Ground Law, which has been such a source of consternation, and of course led to the death of Trayvon Martin and the exoneration of George Zimmerman. That piece of relevance, when you found that, when you were looking through those and you saw all these people, man's house is his castle, man's house is his castle, that had to be just a big Florida light bulb.
Oh, absolutely. And I spent a lot of time, I covered the trial of George Zimmerman in person, but I spent a lot of time studying the Stand Your Ground Law, maybe over the course of about 2 years, 2012 or so. We did a big project about, cases where it was pretty clear that justice had been miscarried because the way this law was written. You wonder, you see situations like George Denning where people of all walks of life come out to support him. At a minimum, take the step of writing a letter, a thoughtful letter to the governor, sometimes over many pages, explaining your legal argument, why you think George Denning was innocent. That the motivation behind that has to be pretty compelling, it seems to me. if your culture is just naturally racist. In 1897, in the South, it wasn't uncommon. Um, so what is the motivation? And that's what I wanted to sort of explore in that. And it seemed to me like it was really more the castle doctrine than it was a sense of fairness. And maybe it was just viewing fairness through the prism of the castle doctrine. But yeah, it's a whole different, interesting bag of worms when you expand upon the castle doctrine and make, and make any place a person has the right to be a place where he can use, you know, where he can kill somebody in his own defense. It's interesting.
Yeah, it's one of those like the life of Bennett Young, where it's just like this is a thing that exists, and I really don't know how to take it with what we know
Right.
about things today.
Right.
Really, just one of the most thought provoking stories I could have imagined coming in for sure.
Yeah. Thanks.
Okay. Yeah, we got time. So Governor Bradley,
Yeah.
at the end of his pardon announcement, and I had actually heard kind of a paraphrased version of this before, had no idea kind of where it had come from, but this line was familiar. Too long have mobs disgraced the fair name of Kentucky, and while I am governor of the Commonwealth, no man, however obscure and friendless, shall be punished for killing a member of a mob who comes to take his life or drive him from his home. Um, and you go on like all the places this was like inscribed on plaques and gold watches and all the places, kind of like a comms director's dream. Like you write a piece of something that gets becomes just something larger than you and stays forever. But it strikes me that 125 years later, at least within the last year, as long as I have known, I should have checked this before. Lynching is still not a federal crime.
Yeah.
We've been trying to pass a federal lynching bill for 100 years. The first one was introduced in while Bennett Young was still alive.
Yeah.
And do you think that kind of federal law is still necessary and important? Do you think that we'll ever get there in our current politics?
Yeah. It's almost important symbolically. Now that we're in this phase where we're considering our past, some of us in a real and honest way, where we have access to things like the 1619 Project to help us sort of reframe the Black experience in America and better understand it, certainly, where, the Republican-led legislature in Florida apologized publicly to the White House boys, to former wards of the Dozier School, saying, "We're sorry for this experience that you had. We're sorry for what happened to you, the hands of state employees." They apologized as well to the Groveland Four, victims of unfair racism by the racist Lake County Sheriff. So there's some rectification that seems to be going on, and I've completely lost track of the original question. But if you just prompt me.
The no federal lynching law.
Yeah. So the closest it turns out the U.S. government ever came to passing federal lynching legislation was after the lynching death of Claude Neal in 1934 in Jackson County, Florida. Neal, if you're not familiar with the story, was accused of killing and raping and murdering a white farm girl. He was arrested the day after her body was found, after a shallow, short investigation. The sheriff tried to keep him safe by moving him from town to town around the Panhandle. He went as far south as Fort Barrancas. He wound up in Bruton, Alabama, in a small town jail, and the mob was on his heels for an entire week. These were some well-to-do members of Jackson County society chasing the sheriff around as he moved Claude Neal from place to place. They finally got him at Bruton, Alabama. The jailer turned over the keys. Uh, they took him to the banks of the Chipola River in Jackson County and tortured him for 8 hours and did unspeakable things to him. I've written about this. Um, and then they dragged his body to a gathered crowd that an AP reporter estimated to be 5,000 people who had shown up from 9 southern states to participate in what would become one of the last spectacle lynchings. Uh, the and that crowd continued to dismember the body, and then they drug him to the sheriff's office in downtown Marianna, and they hung him from an oak tree, and took pictures and so forth, and then rioted and ran the black citizens of Marianna out of town and burned their businesses and so forth. So, that here's the thing about that. There's a young man who grew up, whose name is Lamar Wilson. He grew up in Jackson County, and he remembers hearing his elder, I think it was his grandmother, talk about that experience, talk about remembering the lynching of Claude Neal in hushed tones. And he got curious about it. And he went to the library and he checked out a book. They had a book called Anatomy of a Lynching. I have a copy of it here somewhere. It was written in 1973 by a West Florida professor, an anthropologist. But it accounted for everything that happened with this especially heinous lynching in which 5,000 people participated. He turned that book in. He went back to get it a short time later. This was all brand new experience for him. He was a teenager growing up in this place. But he went back to get it a short time later and it wasn't there. And he asked the librarian where that book went. And she said, oh, somebody takes that book. We have to kind of routinely buy new copies because somebody just steals it out of the library. And so he has taken it upon himself to, every time a copy goes missing, to buy 2 copies for the library. And he keeps them in stock of this story that played out in that community just a couple of miles away. My whole point in telling this parable is that, this is us. This is not past. This is who we are, and this is what we live with. All of this stuff is swirling right now. And the better we understand it, and the better we understand the roots of it and the history of it, I think the better equipped we are to make this society more equitable, more just, and more peaceful. And, I like to keep sight of that.
Awesome. Ben, thank you so much. We do have one question from Christina, and I think since she asked this question, you touched on it a little bit, but if you want to go into more detail, she asked, what sources did you find useful in researching this story?
I went with as much as I could possibly get. I spent a couple of weeks in Simpson County, Kentucky, in their historical society, looking through every record that seemed promising, including detailed census records, local census, local school board records. I found George Denning's name a few times in things like probate records, where somebody would die and his family would have an estate sale, and they would write the name of every person who bought something and the item that person bought and how much they paid for it. It's just, they did a good job of record keeping back in the day. Well, found George Denning bought some hay hooks at this estate sale, and he bought a spotted cow at this estate sale, and so forth. The criminal trial transcript in the governor's papers was clutch. All of the letters that people wrote on Denning's behalf to the governor saying, pardon this man, all of those were in the governor's files as well. And so those were, those were great to have. Newspapers of the day. I found George Denning's medical admission form, which was a complete surprise. When he got assaulted in Louisville and when he was a free man, I found the form that showed that he had checked into the hospital under his name, slightly misspelled, and what his injuries were and that sort of thing. So, I try to get as much information as I possibly can and try to drill down really deep as I can go the key piece of information that's missing is where George Denning is buried. After all this, after living such an incredible life, when he died in 1930, I think, he was buried under a tombstone, but there was a flood a few years later that ruined the records at that cemetery. And I don't know if the tombstone was lost or covered or misplaced or what, but his people have looked for years now around that cemetery for some kind of marker with his name on it, but it doesn't. Nobody can find it.
Well, Ben, I want to thank you for your time. And while I still have some listeners here, I just want to remind everyone we do have an online event with Lauren Groff next week, Wednesday night, 7 o'clock. You can find all of that information on our Facebook page. Ben, where can they follow you on social media?
On Instagram at Ben_writes, or on Twitter at Gangrey, Gangrey.
Awesome. Well, thank you.
You're good, man. Great questions, Matt. Thank you so much. Thanks to Midtown Reader. Y'all hang in there. This pandemic will end at some point. Books will always be with us no matter what happens.
Books will always be with us. Thanks, Ben. Have a good one.
Thank you.
Have a good day.